What's going on, guys? It's Mike for SimRacing604, and welcome to what could be considered a long-term review of Assetto Corsa Competizione for PC. Much of what I'll speak about here will apply to the console versions as well, but PC is where I've spent the majority of my time in ACC, so that's what I will focus on. So why am I making a review for a game that debuted years ago? Well, it occurred to me that I'd never really given this title a proper review. Initially, it was released in early access, which of course wouldn't be fair to review, and then for about a year, it always seemed like it was one bug fix away from greatness. But lately, it's been pretty stable and found its groove in the sim racing niche, so it just feels like the right time for a new review. And I don't want to belabor the history of the title too much, but here's a brief rundown of how things came to be with ACC. Kunos Simulazione had established a name for themselves with the first Assetto Corsa back in 2014, and then in 2018 we got word that a follow-up would be a GT3 only title, and it did not support mods. This was a big deal, of course, because mods were such a key part of the success and popularity of Assetto Corsa 1. The title also looked to establish itself as a major player in the online racing scene. It was released to the public in early access with just one car and one track available to drive, and the reception was pretty tepid. There were complaints about the force feedback initially, and then as early access progressed, the system taxing VR became a focal point, and finally the title reached version 1.0, and it was evident that the player base wasn't capable of producing well-populated competitive lobbies. But from this slow start, ACC has now risen to an incredible level of popularity and overcome most of its initial shortcomings. And it achieved this, I guess you could say, phoenix-like rise through three major steps forward, in my opinion. The 5-point tire model that was introduced in August of 2019, the 2019 update for this title in October of that same year, and then the GT4 DLC last September. There were more things improved, of course, throughout the timeline, but in my mind, those three updates were the biggest leaps in the growth of the title. So that's about all the history I feel compelled to share here, but hopefully it's enough to give some context for this review. Rather than my usual MO of going through graphics, sounds, drivability, and so forth, I'm going to lump the features into things I like, things that I don't like or need improving, and finally I'll do some speculation on what the future could bring for Kunos and the Assetto Corsa franchise. So starting with the good far outweighs the bad for me in this title, so this video is going to be heavily front biased. Two easy assets for ACC are the graphics and sounds. The interior and exterior details of the cars is second to none in sim racing, as are the track details. And calling graphics lifelike is a statement that tends to age very poorly, but relative to this day and age, the visuals are exactly that. The use of light during different times of day is gorgeous, and the sounds are outstanding too. And granted, the sound engineering workload is less with this title because it's limited to only 2 car classes, but for that limited scope, they absolutely nailed it. And the auditory sort of violence you hear in the real-life onboards of these cars is recreated in this title with the loud knocks and bangs to complement the excellent engine notes, both in the car and outside. In terms of the physics and force feedback of ACC, any strong opposition to what Kunos has done here is becoming more and more rare. Prior to the 5-point tire model, cars in ACC were subjected to unpredictable behavior over curbs, and slides were unusually tough to catch. But the current build of this title is much more predictable and not what I would consider easy, especially at the top of the leaderboard. But getting a GT3 around Spa in 2 minutes and 25 seconds, for example, is a pretty manageable task for most experienced sim racers. Getting that time down to the 2:20 mark requires some aggression and a good setup, and dipping below 2:19 requires a good understanding of the car, a lot of aggression, and a good setup. And I think that speaks to the realism of the driving model. There are titles that allow you to set real-world record pace not long after you start playing it, but Competizione forces you to push yourself and improve as a driver. The next thing that falls into the good category for me is the UI. It's probably the least discussed best-in-industry feature of ACC. Booting into the race takes only seconds, and everything you might want to adjust is easy to find and well laid out menus. Most of these menus can even be adjusted in-game. Some people might not care about the menus in a racing title, but R Factor 2 proves that when it's done wrong, it can hinder the enjoyment of a game overall. But that is not the case here. The content in Assetto Corsa Competizione has taken somewhat of a circuitous route to get to the successful place it is now. At the time of initial release, there's about a dozen cars to be raced on roughly 10 tracks, and compared to the thousands of cars available in the previous AC thanks to mods, it felt like too little. But even now, as the title rolls into 2021, the nearly 40 cars is way less than many other racing titles, but Kunos took things another way. Rather than give us hundreds of cars that more or less drive the same, they elected to give us the best versions of the cars and tracks possible. Everything down to the brake pad type on the cars and the drainage systems on the tracks has been recreated here. Personally, I hope to see more titles go for the quality over quantity model in the future, as it seems to have worked out great here. Single-player racing is another strong aspect of ACC. In addition to good AI to race against, a well-done hot lap mode, this game also has special events to try out where you can test your speed in hot laps, hot stints, or super pulls, and it's ranked against other drivers from around the world. And for those who want a one-off sprint race, ACC offers great time of day and weather options. You can set up anything from a warm, peaceful day to a storm, and you can run during the day, at night, or set time acceleration and do both in a short time span. The options are pretty much limitless. It's a really great feature to complement the driving. Lastly, in the good category, the multiplayer and ranking systems. Early after the announcement that ACC was in development, rumors started to surface that Competizione was going to be a contender with iRacing for the online sim racing crown. It's not iRacing, and nor did Kunos ever claim it would be, but the multiplayer is overall very nicely done. I've run a few seasons of my own league in ACC, and shout out to the whole crew there, but the experience has been solid overall with online racing, and the competition servers are also active, which filters out amateurs by imposing minimum driver ratings for entry. And speaking of those driver ratings, the inclusion in ACC has been a good move, especially with the ability to grow your rating in single player mode. No driver rating system is perfect, but this title is better served by having one rather than not having one. Moving on now to the bad, and while there's entire systems in this title that fall into the good category, the bad section of this video will be a small number of bugs and idiosyncrasies. The game is incredibly good overall, but not perfect. The first thing that comes to mind is the VR efficiency. Granted, the latest generation CPU and GPU builds seem to have improved the experience. You can still expect to tax your system quite heavily to run ACC in VR. And if you have a PC more than a few years old, you can pretty much forget about it. Also, it'd be great to have some improvements to the endurance racing system, with driver swaps being easier than what's currently in place, and reverse grids can be fun, but right now that's not natively possible. Also relating to racing, an improved broadcast mode would definitely be helpful. People who really get broadcasting dialed in can do some incredible work, but it's not easy to get to that point. And also, it's notable that we can't race multi-class in single player. Almost any other modern sims allows for 2 or more classes to race, so it's conspicuously absent here. And the other major head scratcher for both single and online racing is the dynamic weather system. Every level of weather in the game is done really well, but setting up a race that transitions between them is confusing and unpredictable. Finally, a couple of things on the back end of the game. At the time of this writing, Crew Chief has ceased support for ACC based on some coding issues, and many of us have come to depend on Crew Chief as an essential app to complement sim racing, so hopefully this can be fixed soon. And also, and this is really a stretch, but DXR-based ray tracing would be cool. So now on to the lighter portion of the video, and my favorite to write. With all of the improvements over the development of this title, what could be next? So at the time of this recording, the British DLC has yet to be released, but I expect it to be the usual level of greatness. So there's that in the immediate future, but looking long term, it's interesting to think whether Manicours or Valencia will be added to this title before the development ends, since both fall into the 2021 GT World Challenge European calendar. But it's also unrealistic to think that Kunos will be able to stay on top of every added venue forever. So if their sights are set beyond ACC, I'm happy with that too. I'd love to see Kunos set their sights on a definitive open wheel series sim. Granted, the licensing for Formula 1 and Formula 2 is a nightmare, but having conquered the tin top simulation, it'd be amazing to see what this team could produce in a dedicated open wheel sim. Or, as Wikipedia notes, Assetto Corsa 2? My personal vision for AC2 would include about 20 circuits and 50 cars with a good mix of sports cars and race cars. I wouldn't be too happy to see mods not being a possibility, but at the same time, I do like what Kunos has done with the Unreal Engine in ACC, so it could be fun with road cars. Alright, so that's it for my updated review. Overall, I think this title is incredible. It's the definitive home simulator for the most popular racing series in sim racing. There's a lot to love here, and it's my go-to sim right now. Even if development ended now, I'd consider ACC a success, but here's hoping there's a lot more to come from Kunos, in this title or the next. Let me know in the comments what you like and don't like, and what you want to see from Kunos in the future, and thank you for watching.